Elephants make up around 450,000 animals on our planet today, forming two genera with 3 total species, 2 in Africa and 1 in Asia. But while almost 500,000 might sound like a lot, this is a dwindling fraction of their former glory, as elephantids were once found on all continents, and the family contained well over 30 species in at least 10 known genera. 14 of these known species belong to the genus Palaeoloxodon, and in this video we're going to tell you why this matters. Palaeoloxodon was home to some of the largest mammals ever to walk the earth, and they walked all over it for hundreds of thousands of years. And stick around for a mention of the dweeby little island cousins of Palaeoloxodon who may or may not have spawned legends. First, it's time for a little bit of elephantine history. Elephants, as the family Elephantidae, pop up in the fossil record from around 10 million years ago. They seem to originate around Africa and Arabia, having descended from weird-looking beta versions called gomphotheres, who had gone a bit overboard with the tusks and had 2 in the bottom jaw as well. The earliest members of our modern genre wandered out of Africa and crossed into Europe, Asia, and the Americas, beginning this migration around 3.5 million years ago. But one of the later migrants, Palaeoloxodon, didn't leave the continent until around 800,000 years ago. And once it did, it became well established across Eurasia. But, like all but the current 2 genre, it would ultimately disappear at the end of the Pleistocene. But we'll come back to that later. Until recently, this elephant genus was misidentified as the Asian elephant Elephas. Debate had been ongoing since its discovery in the 17th and 18th century, with it having been categorized as anything from a mammoth to a mythical beast. But by the 2010s, genetic analysis on a remarkable specimen, now conclusively called Palaeoloxodon antiquus, showed that this line had an early African base, with over a third of its genes coming from the African forest elephant, and a small fraction coming from mammoths. Subsequent studies confirmed more evidence of a messy historical hybridization and incredibly vast migrations out of Africa. But it wouldn't be the genetic makeup of P. antiquus that would be its most astonishing feature. Palaeoloxodon is of particular interest to science as a genus, because it contains some of the most massive mammals ever to walk on land, and Palaeoloxodon antiquus might have been the biggest of them all. Commonly known as the Straight-Tusked Elephant, this name doesn't really give any clue as to the absolute unit behind them. Palaeoloxodon antiquus fossils have been found all over Eurasia, spanning a period of hundreds of thousands of years from the mid-Pleistocene, and they were enormous. These were animals whose lives were likely very similar to the largest animals on land today. African bush elephants, which grow up to a deeply imposing 3.2 meters at the shoulder, and can weigh up to 6 or 7 tons. These are the heaviest and biggest terrestrial animals on the planet, weighing more even than the largest of the killer whales, and yet they are less than half the weight of the straight-tusked elephant. Palaeoloxodon antiquus is estimated to have weighed over 13 tons, and it stood over 4 meters tall at the shoulder. And this would be a common occurrence. In optimal growth conditions, these figures would be nudged up to 19 tons, and possibly more than 4.6 meters or more at the shoulder. The tusks on this monstrosity alone could be over 3 meters long, up to 4 meters in some cases, and it had proportionally longer legs than modern elephants. The skull, too, was wider than we normally see in members of the family, and they sported a huge bulge on the front of the head like we see in Asian elephants, but much bigger. The males would be the larger of the sexes, obviously, and females were relatively petite, at roughly the same size as the largest of the bull elephants around today. And it appears that this genus lived very much like modern elephants do today. Herds would be led by the elder females, and males would probably have been dispersed after reaching maturity. This would take at least 15 years, and it would result in a pretty lonely existence for the enormous males, and probably a very violent one too. Though male elephants today are not entirely violent and solitary, they are known to seek out companionship and appreciate each other's presence to a degree. They're also important role models for younger males who will meet them at watering holes as youths, as they start to get to know who they'll be able to trust when their time comes to leave the herd. But given the roughly even sex ratios of baby elephants, males are at a strong disadvantage, and are likely considered more disposable since, even in cases of infant mortality, males make up a high majority. So reaching the enormous sizes of Palaeoloxodon would have been a significant challenge and come at a tremendous cost. Male elephants also go through a period of intense hormonal changes during mating periods. And as terrifying and dangerous as this is among modern elephants, it must have been a sight to behold for our ancestors to face a rampaging Palaeoloxodon in this state. Unfortunately, the increase in insanity from the flood of testosterone, coupled with the enormous weight of the males, would have led to more cases of bulls getting stuck in tar pits and other natural traps. And this has actually resulted in a far higher number of bull elephant fossils from this genus being found over those of the cows. It's thought they spent more time in forests than bush elephants do today, and this might explain the straight tusks in Antiquus, as modern forest elephants also have straighter tusks than their savanna counterparts. Being so much larger, they likely would have taken over 30 years to reach full size, and perhaps lived well into their 80s. Analyses on their teeth show that they had a varied diet and adapted with the seasons from grasses to leaves, bark, and rough shrubs depending on what was available. And where they overlapped with mammoth species as they did in Britain 200,000 years ago, this would have helped them avoid competition. Palaeoloxodon stomped all over Europe from Italy to Denmark and into Russia, long before woolly mammoths would have had their time on the steppe. And during this time, some believe that our ancestors, Homo heidelbergensis, were pottering about preparing to give rise to us, as well as the Denisovians and the first true Europeans, the Neanderthals. Our prehistoric ancestors and cousins were a lot more sophisticated than we tend to give them credit for, and 600,000 years ago in what is now England, they were already thriving. But unlike the agricultural wasteland of today, England of the time was plastered in forest, and Palaeoloxodon was there too. As the native mammoth species started to decline, it would be the straight-tusked elephant who took their place, and our ancestors, as small as they were in comparison, were hunting them. These elephants weren't as adapted to the glacial periods as some of the woollier mammals that would arise, so they became far more widespread during interglacial periods. Multiple Palaeoloxodon remains have been found with marks attributed to human tools on them, but at least one very convincing sample from Germany, said to be around 115,000 years old, had almost a full spear embedded between its ribs. And all of these finds come from a time beginning around 500,000 years ago, long before Homo sapiens made it onto the continent. And this suggests that it was Neanderthals and heidelbergensis who were tackling these beasts first. Early humans didn't just eat these elephants, they also made tools and instruments from their ivory, and perhaps even houses from their skin and tusks. And they do this all over Eurasia. Like any mammals with good taste, Palaeoloxodon enjoyed a permanent residence in the Mediterranean. And remember, the genus wasn't made up purely of antiquus. There were plenty of other species spread across the globe as well, and big ones. The oldest known, and the species thought to be ancestral to most of the others, was Palaeoloxodon recci, an African species of over 4 meters tall as well. China had its own 4-meter example with Palaeoloxodon huaioensis, and India had P. nematicus, who was even taller at around 4.3 meters. There are at least 14 species described, and many of them truly bigger than land animals should ever be, but the genus was also home to some of the cutest little giant elephants the world has ever seen. And some of these little tiny elephants would reinforce concepts of mythical beings among authors of some of our oldest literature. Before we come to that, though, it's time again to thank you all for watching and remind you that your support can really help us grow the channel. And it doesn't have to cost any more than a couple of clicks, so please give this video a like if you're enjoying it and add yourself to the subscribers list if you haven't already. So, from the largest elephants ever known to walk the land to some of the smallest, the straight-tusked elephant is said to have sired at least 6 species of dwarf elephant, almost as if to balance things out. These dwarves came from offshoots of the residents of the Mediterranean communities, who would eventually become isolated on islands as sea levels rose and would shrink to a more accommodating size in order to survive in their smaller ecosystems. The straight-tusked elephant went extinct around 44,000 years ago, perhaps not coincidentally around the time that modern humans started to show up. Some stragglers held out a little longer, such as those in the Netherlands whose remains date to 37,000 years ago, which too is around the time modern humans showed up there. But the island offspring would remain untouched for thousands more years, and in Cyprus, for example, they would reach diminutive sizes of less than a meter tall. And when some very recent communities of Homo sapiens from some of the earliest modern civilizations rediscovered these islands, they would find skulls of these tiny elephants that reminded them of some of their mythical historical monsters. And that's because at the front of an elephant's skull there's a huge hole where the nasal cavity for the trunk once was. And when all the flesh is stripped away, this gives the look of having a single large eye. And the ancient Greeks had a name for giants like that: Cyclops. It's often repeated that elephant skulls were the inspiration for the Cyclops, but it's far more likely that these legends came well before the elephant skulls were discovered, and instead the latter simply served to reinforce these legends. It's also very possible that the Greeks were well aware that elephant skulls existed and what they looked like, and that they weren't magic at all. Regardless, there's no denying the resemblance, at least in some examples. Being an interglacial species, when climate conditions became unfavorable again around 115,000 to 57,000 years ago, Palaeoloxodon antiquus retreated from northern Europe. The species likely survived until around 28,000 years ago and would probably have been finished off by modern humans in Europe. Island dwarves remained in place until at least around 10,000 years ago, with some perhaps surviving far later. Some evidence suggests that a single Greek island was home to a species of dwarf Palaeoloxodon as recently as 3,000 years ago, but this hasn't been strongly confirmed yet. Ultimately, the genus would disappear from our planet as one of many of the victims of the late Pleistocene megafaunal extinction, for which we sapiens are more or less solely responsible, as we have been for 96% of all mammalian extinctions over the last 120,000 years. But on a lighter note, if you'd like to learn about how our sister species did a much better job of custody of the European continent, head over to our recent video on what the Neanderthals did all day and check that out. As for this one, that's all for now. Thanks again for watching and see you next time.